Greetings programs, welcome to episode 5, How Role-Playing Taught Me Critical Thinking. So this one's going to be a little different. First off, we need to describe what critical thinking is. It's not simply being smart. Critical thinking is about the quality of your thought, not the speed of it. Though a person with good critical thinking skills can seem smarter because their thinking works better. Here is a definition. Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing and/or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. In its exemplary form, it is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions: clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, sound evidence, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness. Or to put it in very short terms, make sure your thinking works. So like a lot of nerds, geeks, and other weirdos, I am into role-playing and have been for a long time, since the age of 13. Don't ask how old I am now. And while I can't speak for all role-players, it has taught me critical thinking. Seriously. I don't think I would be anywhere near as rational as I am now, were it not for this, however good or bad you think that may be. So how did this work, and what do I mean by all this? Well, first off, we need to explain what role-playing in this context refers to. Role-playing, also called tabletop role-playing, is a social activity, where a group of people gather around a table, usually, to tell a story. You get to play a role, and silly voices are optional. If you have ever played a computer adventure game and been frustrated at the limited options for conversation, you'll have some idea of where the weakness of that medium lies and where the strength of tabletopping lies. Around the table, there is one person who essentially takes the role of the computer. They write the story, take the role of the villains and shopkeepers, random people you encounter in the world, monsters, random animals, scenery, and then they invite you into their world to adventure, to build a name, generally be somebody much cooler than your actual self for a few hours. They're usually called the Games Master or GM for short. Now, where a computer can give you instant feedback on mechanics like hit rolls and such, a human GM is much slower, and thus the roles for doing things need to be much simpler. But unlike a computer, the GM has a brain and a personality. They can make things up on the fly. When dealing with bystander characters, also known as an NPC or non-player character in a computer game, you have limited fixed options, usually something like 1. Trade, 2. Ask about the town, 3. Extort money, 4. Leave. But in a tabletop game, the human player is talking to a human GM and is doing anything that they can think of, or at least try to. Maybe the description of the NPC sounds cute and the player wants to hit on them. Maybe the player wants to point out the obvious and that the dragon is going to eat the kingdom, and if anybody is hiding magic swords they better hand them over. Or somebody else is getting eaten. Maybe the player has magic and just wants to mind control the NPC. The possibilities are endless and vastly more social than sitting behind a keyboard. Okay, so that's tabletop roleplaying. But wait, what's that, you say? Imaginary interviewer, what's that got to do with critical thinking? Why, I'm glad you asked. Role-playing lets you try ideas and see what works, and that's sort of useful, I guess. But it's being the GM that really does it, for 2 main reasons. 1, you have to understand the motivations of the bad guys. Why is Evil Prince La-di-da being nasty? You can't just say he's evil and walk away, not if you want a story that works for a person over the age of 6. Even Disney villains have actual reasons for what it is they're doing. Snow White's stepmom was threatened by her beauty and wanted the threat gone. It's not a great reason, but it is a reason. Certainly better than, they're just evil, okay, don't think about it. It also pays to understand a little bit of philosophy. Villains in stories and in real life don't think they're villains. They're heroes of a different story, their story. And in trying to understand villains, it can teach you that bad people are not just magically tainted with evil and that's their only motivation, which in itself is an important life lesson. And teaching you to think about the evil people in a story teaches you something, that you can be the villain in somebody else's story, even if you think you're proceeding from the purest of motives. Remember, the death camp guards in World War II were just ordinary people for the most part. Some of them thought they were doing the right thing, some didn't care, some just wanted to survive. They were not all psychopaths. That could have been you under other circumstances. So this is a bit of critical thinking associated with people, something that could almost be called wisdom in the right light. The second part of being a GM is thinking through the consequences of the player's actions. What happens next? If the players have just looted the tomb on Dragon Mountain and stagger back to the village with sacks full of gold, claiming to have just killed the dragon, what do you think will happen? Well, first off, some enterprising person is going to go up the mountain and see if there's any loot the party have missed. I mean, wouldn't you? Free money, just for the taking. Second, someone is going to think it's easier just to steal some of the party's gold than to risk some overlooked trap or bad guy up the mountain. One pocket full of gold is several years' wages for most people, and here they are with the party with sackfuls of the stuff. Then the economy is going to go crazy. Because if the party is throwing around vast gobs of money and not caring about the cost, which, if you have sackfuls of gold, you won't, prices are going to skyrocket. Why would the innkeeper sell a beer to Joe for a tin coin when the strangers will pay a whole silver for one, or more? And then what happens when the locals can't buy stuff because the prices are so high? And you'll have people begging for money, some legitimately, some not. Then you'll have the border guards taxing rich travellers and so on. Huge amounts of wealth tends to make people act a little crazy, and more. Thinking about the consequences of things like this forces you to learn what might happen down the line from our actions. And while this is not exactly critical thinking either, it is along the same sorts of lines. And now we come to the second part. Blair. Everyone needs a Blair in their life. Now, as a GM, Blair for me was kind of a dream player. Lots of players would do only the tactically optimal thing no matter what, or play unrealistic, pure as a driven snow characters. And while there's a certain fun to be had in acting smart and logical, real life doesn't work that way. Otherwise no one would ever make mistakes, or drink, or have to deal with unplanned pregnancies, or the results of stupid plans that seemed like a smart idea at the time, but when you woke up in the morning didn't seem so cool. Now Blair would play people with real character flaws, and he was funny, and he was smart, and he would do human things that were suboptimal in terms of the smartest things to do, but were the sorts of things that real people would do. And he was entertainingly insane, so he came up with all the best ideas. But the reason he's here on this list is the way he taught me to think critically. Really. Because Blair would exploit the shit out of any rules loopholes or misspoken word. It was like role-playing with the devil, as defined by any number of Hollywood movies, or role-playing with a lawyer. And while it was sometimes frustrating, almost always the frustration was with myself for not watching what I spoke, for going out on a limb and giving him the opportunity to skewer me with my own words. And that is just annoying. And that is how I really learned critical thinking. Because Blair would exploit anything exploitable. Any holes in the story, any holes in the rules, anything you missaid. Seriously. So while there is more to critical thinking than constantly checking to see if you've left any loopholes in your position, it's a bloody good start. Because when you have somebody who, while having fun and not being a complete prick about it, undermines everything you say that is illogical or that you cannot back up, it sure is good training for thinking critically and being rational. Because you learn never to say anything that you can't back with evidence on demand, which is useful by itself, but is super helpful for getting you into the habit of checking your sources. How do I know what I'm saying is true? Do I really want someone else to point out that my source is like from an article in The Onion or something? I'd better check my sources. I'd better check that what I'm about to say is backed by science or evidence or both. I better check and make sure that scientist X isn't one of those ones that goes a bit crazy in their old age, or one of those ones that go a bit woo-woo when they talk about subjects outside their field. Yes, it does happen, they are human. I better check and make sure it's not an article from a non-science mainstream news source. They are famous for clickbait headlines and just getting it wrong after all, even if they are now being replaced by robots. More on that in the next vid, I think. And that's the central core of critical thinking. There's more to it than that, of course, but the central part is, what do I think I know and how do I know it? Sometimes known as rationality, which is more of the same, but involving dealing with cognitive biases. That checking, that assumption that you might have bad information and that you should check to make sure. That habit of not going out on a limb without checking first to see if there's any way it could be sawn off behind you. That's the core of learning to think critically. What do I know and how do I think I know it? And while it might sound a bit paranoid to always be on guard, I'd describe it as learning the habit of not shooting your mouth off. Don't write checks your body can't cash, which I think most people would agree is a good thing. So that's critical thinking, how my experiences as a nerdy roleplayer got me started, especially trying to contain and thereby understand a world with my very own Blair picking away at it. It's kind of like why evolution is the strongest and most robust theory in science. If it is constantly attacked and any weaknesses exposed, the stronger it gets. And the same for how you think. So that's all for today. Next week's episode is probably going to be why I like head rushers and conservatives don't, which is all about the Big Five personality model and the things it tells us, and why it's different from all the ones that went before. Bye for now.